I'll put up slides only when I'm presenting ethnographic vignettes. I really want everybody to get the ethnographic vignettes because that will help you in the second session when we talk about policies, because I want us all to be able to brainstorm around policies, and that we can do only if we are quite intimately familiar with the global fertility industry. Okay, so what I was saying is what Ale presented today in the form of global production networks and global commodity chains, as well as the myth of naturalness, how that's used to make women workers become disposable. This will all be very useful for understanding this industry as well. And also, thinking about the kind of research that all of you presented, the vignettes that you presented yesterday, I think you can also brainstorm about the fertility industry based on your own research ideas. So is our body our property, for instance, for those who work on property? Are there some parallels between our understanding of land ownership, land tenure, and women's bodies in this industry? How do we make sense of black women's reproductive bodies in this industry given the history of colonialism and slavery? How do we grapple with ideas of feminization, naturalization, de-skilling in an industry that is fundamentally built on the bodies of women? This industry cannot exist without women, unlike the other industries that we've talked about. Could we instead think of women's involvement in this industry as an extractive industry, much like mining? Aren't there significant parallels between surrogacy and other forms of more mundane reproductive labor like domestic work? And for some of you, and from the conversations we've had over tea and dinner, it seems like some of you are beginning to dabble with science and technology in society scholarship. I ask you to see how this connects with the more recent conversation that we had today around labor, technology, as well as technology and racialization of labor. I won't be able to speak too much about racialization, but that's why I put the related publication Mix or Match that appeared 2 years ago in Medical Anthropology, where you can look at the bibliography, lots of stuff about racialization there. Okay, so essentially what I want you to do is not sensationalize this industry, but connect it to your own work so that we can actually have a productive session after tea, I think. Okay? But let's start with the nuts and bolts, because I don't want to assume that all of you know what I mean by the global fertility industry. If I'm not clear, please feel free to raise your hand and ask me what am I talking about, okay? So what is the global fertility industry? So what's happening is that with the growth in what is called assisted reproductive technologies, ART, the assumption that conception is about one man, one woman, and sexual intercourse has been completely disrupted. The making of the baby has become an enterprise with a market for every possible related service. And in the past decade, with globalization, what has happened that these markets and technologies have taken a cross-border turn. Partly because of cost considerations, people want to save money, but also because of restrictive laws in some countries around ART and ART use, who gets to use ART. So patients or clients or what we call intended parents now travel across the world to get either a genetically related baby or a baby custom made to their preference. Again, I won't have that much time to talk about custom made to preference babies, but we can talk about it in Q&A if you want. So what's happening now is the task of reproducing a baby is divided into neat segments, and each segment can be potentially outsourced to various service providers in different parts of the world. Okay, so it's possible that the egg provider, and note that I say egg provider and not egg donor, because very seldom are they really donors. So the egg provider can come from one part of the world, the embryo is created in another part of the world, and the embryo is transferred into the womb of a gestational mother, which people like to call surrogate mother, from yet another part of the world. And finally, the baby is transported back to its intended home and intended parents. So in some sense, what the global fertility industry is doing, that is not just connecting a baby with its intended parents, but also fertility professionals, travel agents, brokers, gamete couriers. There are actually courier services, which is about carrying gametes from here to there, corporations, states, and of course, the women involved in this industry. So my journey into this rather weird world started nearly 16 years ago, and then it culminated into the book Wombs and Labor. And what I'm going to do is, so I'm going to read you an excerpt from Wombs and Labor. As I said, I think these ethnographic vignettes, the data are very important for you to then actually decide what theoretic frame to use. Okay, so the book came out in 2010, I think, or 2012, but this excerpt is from 2006. Okay, so field note 2006, what I call Arman Maternity Clinic in Garh, India. The room is lined with 8 beds, one next to the other, with barely enough space to walk in between. A ceiling fan groans above. Some of the beds are raised on one side with a block, so that the women can have their legs elevated after their embryo transfer or any gynecological checkups. There's nothing else in the room. Each bed has a pregnant woman resting on it. This is their home for the next 9 months. Their husbands can visit, but they cannot stay the night. It's a reminder that they cannot have sex, not for the next few months. The women are still in their night clothes, and it's nearly evening. The day has been planned for them. The morning visit from the doctor, 8 a.m. breakfast, 9 a.m. medicine, 10 a.m. rest hour, 12 p.m. injections, followed by an afternoon nap. The evening is nothing different, except perhaps the broker will bring in a new member. A bed will be added to the room. Another pregnant woman will join the ranks. Okay, I'm going to read out an updated field note, now from the same clinic, but 10 years after the first one was written. So I revisited the clinic in 2016 after commercial surrogacy has been officially banned in India. Okay, so this is field note from April 2016. This is New Arman Fertility Clinic. I'm at Dr. Durga's brand new fertility clinic, a 3-storied glass and steel building in the middle of fields. The reception area is straight out of a science fiction novel, clean, high-tech, a bit too clean, a bit too high-tech for its surroundings, almost artificial in its efficiency. There are no people except the staff of the clinic, very unlike the bustling, chaotic, and slightly grubby clinics I have worked in India in the past. The basement is the domain of surrogates or women who are gestational mothers. They're home for the next few months. There are 12 beds with 10 beds in each. Almost all are occupied by women in various stages of their pregnancy. Some are sitting, most are lying down watching a cartoon play on loop on the television. There's a feel of everything working in slow motion, a complete contrast to the high-tech efficiency upstairs. Unlike my last visits, where women in the surrogacy hostel spoke constantly with loud laughter, giggles, and high fives of camaraderie amidst all the pain and the hopes of changing their lives through this work, the underlying mood today is of boredom. Aarti seems to speak for them all when she says, "I don't even know whether I'll get paid anymore. The government has told the doctor that this surrogacy is wrong. I don't know if it's right or wrong for them. I thought it was right for me." Okay, so I wrote Wombs and Labor when surrogacy was a flourishing industry in India. And now it has been pretty much banned and has become a taboo subject for most fertility clinics. How did this ban on surrogacy affect my research, affect India's role in the fertility industry? But what I want to do today is connected to a far more fascinating thing. How did this ban connect India to South Africa and different parts of Africa in very unexpected ways in a global chain? Okay, is it quite clear to everyone what is commercial surrogacy? Okay, and what is gestational surrogacy? Okay, let me clarify that. Okay, so commercial surrogacy, I'm not talking about this little industry sitting in the backyards of some place in India. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry across the world. And India was the world leader before it banned it. United States, especially California, is the other world leader. What gestational surrogacy means is that, for instance, if it's a South African couple who cannot conceive naturally for whatever reason, or these are two men who want to have a genetically related baby, what they'll do is they will use, and almost always they will use, the sperm of the intended father. For gay couples, they use the sperm of one of the intended fathers. They will get the egg of the intended mother if it's a heterosexual relation. So there comes the egg donor. So they'll be convinced to get an egg donor. And then this will be fused in an embryo, and the embryo will be implanted into the womb of the gestational mother. So essentially what's happening is that the Indian woman has no genetic connections with the baby. She's literally the oven for the bun, is what they say. And that's why this word called surrogate or substitute mother, which again we can talk about whether that makes sense. Okay, and even though we might not have been talking about surrogacy at this meeting, feminists have been talking about surrogacy for the past 40 years now in some form or the other. So there's one camp of the liberal feminists who you can guess that they talk about right of a woman to do what she pleases with her body. Then there's a lot of literature, primarily coming from the north, written primarily by white men, which talks, and bioethicists, which talks about the ethics of this practice. Again, feminist philosophers have also written extensively on this. Then there's the literature that focuses on the multiple systems of exploitation and oppression that are potentially reinforced by this practice. And in the last decade, what has emerged are mostly ethnographic work, sociology, anthropology, on the lived experiences of surrogacy. And I suppose my work gets classified there. But in general, surrogacy is a practice that makes people anxious, and I don't think I need to tell you in detail why. And especially this anxiety increases multifold when the surrogate is sitting in a country in the global south. And again, as I said, when I started my work in this field, everybody who was talking about surrogacy was talking about and writing from Europe and North America. And not surprising, because surrogacy was happening in only North America and Europe. But that didn't mean that feminists were not making alarming predictions about what will happen when this does travel to the global south. For instance, feminist Andrea Dworkin said in 1978, while sexual prostitutes sell vagina, rectum and mouth, reproductive prostitutes would sell other body parts, wombs, ovaries and eggs. And sociologist Barbara Rothman in 1988 asked, can we look forward to baby farms with white embryos grown in young and third world women? But as I started living with the gestational mothers in India in their crowded surrogacy hostels for my research, cooked lunches for them, attended embroidery lessons with them, mandatory English classes with them, I came to realize that this textbook and northern-centric understanding of surrogacy was just not going to work for the kind of surrogacy I was seeing unravel in front of me in India. And now, of course, it has spread to not just India, to Thailand, Nepal, Mexico, Cambodia, Laos, and now that these countries, in this domino effect of India banning surrogacy, Thailand banned it, Nepal banned it, Cambodia banned it, Laos banned it. So now where has it gone? Where do you think it's gone? It's come here, to Africa, right? It always does. So it's moved to the African countries of Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria, and Ghana. And we can talk a little bit more because they're very different the way it's coming into these countries. And remember, and I must emphasize this, I am not talking about the local fertility industry. Each country in the world has some form of fertility technology and treatment available of whatever kind, whether small clinics, big clinics, where they are catering to their own people. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the global fertility industry, and that's very important to understand. And I'll explain to you in a second why. But let me talk a little bit more as to why it makes sense to talk about this industry in a workshop on worlds of work. Now, what I argue today and what I've argued in the past is that it would be a mistake to think of surrogacy as a story of reproduction. Because it's not about just a private, intimate transaction, because what it does is that it makes us forget many, many complexities. One complexity is that when women participate in this industry, they're participating in a very problematic, deviant, sometimes considered dirty, and hence stigmatized, unnatural market. You will see parallels with sex work there. While yes, it is true, and this is very important to also emphasize, it is true that many of these women are forced into surrogacy by their family, very often by their husbands, very often by their mother-in-laws. But many others negotiate with their families to gain control over their own bodies and their fertility in order to participate in this process. And as surrogates, they suddenly find themselves in a very strange situation. They have all the medical facilities they had never accessed these medical facilities before, because they were poor women in a country in the global south, and mostly antenatal country, where they've been told that you produce too many babies, stop producing babies. So they've been told, and the emphasis of the state has been on population control. They have never been able to access C-sections even when they needed to. They have never been able to access any kind of healthcare, reproductive healthcare, even when they needed to. But suddenly they are bombarded with this healthcare, because of course now they're producing a baby for a richer or a whiter couple to keep. And as soon as I say white, rich, of course they also have to navigate this really interesting relationship across race, class, and nationality. So we cannot think of surrogacy as an ethical dilemma to be solved in abstraction. We must get our hands dirty, messy, and understand that this is a very peculiar, particular kind of reproductive labor. And in the book I call it embodied labor, because of course this is it's an embodied form of labor. There cannot be any other labor that is more embodied than surrogacy. And partly we'll come to that in egg donation as well. It's also a dirty, stigmatized labor. And again, we can talk about why it's so considered dirty and stigmatized, even though the women are producing a so-called priceless baby. Although also it involves contradictory forms of kin labor. And the women involved in the industry will often call this God's labor, because they are doing what they call in Hindi punya ka kaam. We are doing something that will give us blessings from God. Okay, so there are very different manifestations of labor here. I'm going to skip a little bit of the theory here, because I want a lot of time for discussion. But anybody who's interested in talking more about why people have not talked about surrogacy as labor before 2006, it's mostly because there's a lot of anxiety about this commodification of women's bodies, commodification of pregnancy, commodification of children. And surrogacy in particular it also defies laws of not just nature but also religion in many countries, right? And it makes people think that, it makes people anxious. Women's reproductive labor, according to them, is intrinsically not a commodity. And also, the bond between a mother and child is assumed to be fundamentally, something that you said, fundamentally different from the bond between a worker and his or her product. And the commercialization of this intimate ties is believed to be degrading for both the mother and the baby. So as soon as I say this to this audience, I can see that you are muttering, because underlying these are some fundamental assumptions about children, mothers, and reproductive labor. One is the uncontested pricelessness of children. Are children really priceless? The natural biological basis of reproductive labor, and the related assumptions that women's reproduction belongs to the sacred special realm. The priceless child, as many people have shown, however, is a historical and contextual construction. And paid parenting and alleged commodification of children has existed forever, whether in form of nannies or in the form of vet nurses, and I'm sure we can come up with many other examples. And the mother-child bond is a social rather than a natural creation, and we know that in this room. As philosopher, and I like quoting her, as philosopher Deborah Sachs puts it, not all women bond with their fetuses. Some choose to abort them. Nor do all mothers bond with their children naturally. Maternal bonding and affection are culturally and socially determined phenomenon, and a mother-child relationship often evolves over time. So let's not go with this assumption of naturalness of anything. So what I have argued for the past decade or so is that what is deeply disturbing is the implicit reification of gender-based dichotomies in every kind of scholarship that existed before the 2000s around surrogacy. So what are the dichotomies or binaries? Private, public, nature, social, reproduction, production, non-market, market. Okay? And so by conceiving of commercial surrogacy, have I lost you all? Are you there? Yeah. By conceiving of commercial surrogacy as labor, we can move towards challenging these gendered dichotomies, and that's why it's important to abandon the exotic and the sensational in this and connect it to all the dialogue we've been having till now in this workshop. Again, I want to add a caveat here. By analyzing surrogacy as a form of labor, the point is not to take conversations away from the dilemmas of surrogacy. It is not to say that surrogacy is like any other occupation of choice. No, it's a deliberate feminist political project that urges us to move away from the spectacular and pay attention to the many layers so that we can unpack them, right? Unpack them as policymakers, union workers, or whatever we are in this room. What I want to do is I want to spend a little bit more time on surrogacy, present you the ethnographic data. Then I'm going to make a jump and talk about another form of embodied labor, which is egg provision by white South African women, and how that, again, that connects a little bit to the question on saffron and how high-end value products can come in conversation with low-end value products. So let's finish with surrogacy. Then I'll give you a short, the same kind of thing about egg provision, similar kind of structure that I gave for surrogacy, I'll give for egg provision. Then we'll move to policy. Okay, so what I want to do today, I don't think you can read that bit in red. And human relationship is critically dependent on the maintenance of a global racial reproductive hierarchy that privileges certain relationships while completely denying others. And this will again help you do the debating in the post-tea session. I'm going to give a quick look at the field. The field is not really that important because, as I said, it started with India. So India was peculiar when it was the first country in the global south. It's no longer peculiar. It has moved to so many countries in the global south, but almost the same kind of thing works for whether we talk about Ghana, Kenya, Cambodia. I've studied the surrogacy market in Cambodia, Laos, Ghana, and India and Nepal. But apparently it's very similar in Thailand as well, and Mexico to some extent as well. So I'm not going to walk you through these because these will work for almost any country in the global south. Okay, structural inequality between the intended parents and the surrogates, which means that the market can be totally informal. Even if there's a written contract, doesn't matter. Is there any chance that a surrogate who's sitting in Gujarat in India or in a little town near Accra in Ghana is going to challenge or fight a custody battle for a couple coming from Britain? It's not going to happen. So that is where the inherent attractiveness of a global fertility market lies. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about the bill in India because now surrogacy has been banned in all countries in the global south. Some regions in Mexico still allow it, but all the countries that had surrogacy, I mean in Asia, so Laos, Cambodia, Nepal, Thailand, India have all banned surrogacy, and that is why it's moved to Africa, right? And again, in Q&A, we can talk about policies in Africa. Mostly, there are no policies in any country in Africa. There are guidelines or bills that exist in Uganda, for instance, but not really. The only one which has binding law is in South Africa. Do we have appetite for this? Yeah, maybe, because I'm thinking of what you said, Lynn, yesterday about interdisciplinarity. And that's, I think, very important for this workshop. And that's why a quick look at, do I need a look at this? Maybe, yes, because we had this conversation again, and this connects to our performance yesterday evening as well. The ethics of doing research. However much we might want to put the word participant in front of participant observation, there's always a hierarchy between the people we observe and us as the researcher. So in some sense, to try and be respectful in ways that are not just about beautifying a project, but to think very carefully about your method. Don't just say, I'm doing qualitative work. What does that mean? What is that qualitative work going to mean? How are you going to research the other or research your own? What are they getting out of it? Why are they going to waste the time talking to you? So there are many things that we need to talk about. And just quickly about those pictures at the bottom, because I think the reason why I have remained immersed in this industry for so long is because I did this work as a performance and not just as an observation or a participant observation. What I did was that after the quintessential things that you have to do as a sociologist who's doing an ethnography, I was approached by a production house in Denmark and Sweden, and we made the book into a performance. And the idea of the performance was not just information provision. So it's always great to take a performance to various parts of the world, go to Sweden and tell white people what it's like in India. But that was not the point. The point was to be able to let the audience dialogue with the surrogates so that they can actually, in some sense, Augusto Boal's way of breaking the barrier, the fourth wall of theatre, and saying, you're going to be able to talk to the surrogates yourself. The surrogates did not agree to that, so we could not have a Skype. At those days, there was no Zoom. We had Skype. We had thought we'll bring the surrogates in. I had thought we would bring the surrogates in through a Skype conversation with audiences across the world, policymakers across the world, but they did not want that. Instead, they gave me the responsibility of playing the real characters. So it's very complicated to explain, so I won't go there, but in a sense, what that did was that it allowed me to play out this offering of surrogacy as labor market through an embroidery workshop with the surrogates, bringing the embroidery that they did to Sweden, to Denmark, to various parts of India, to South Africa, to Ghana. So these women are real people. They're not just wombs or pregnant things lying in a clinic somewhere. They're real people who also do other kind of tangible work like embroidery. The other work that they're doing is also surrogacy. And then through the play, through the performance and the docudrama, we were able to allow the audience to come on stage and talk about why it is so hard for them to accept surrogacy as a labor market. What is it? And it was always different, whether that be in Denmark, Sweden, South Africa, or India, or the United States. Very different anxieties emerged. Great fun. So apart from being great fun, I think multimodality is a brilliant way to break the power dynamics and to have a real dialogue. But again, we can talk about that if we ever get time over tea or drinks, which have been promised to me later. All married, of course. I think anybody familiar with the surrogacy law in any country in the world would know, any country in the global south would know that that is important for people to know, that the woman is married and she has an existing healthy child, and then only she is potentially a good worker for this industry. Very often they also want the husband's consent. Paid very badly in almost all cases. In India, when I started doing the work, all the women were in, the reason why for them it made sense to do surrogacy as work is because their median family income was below the poverty line. Apparently things are changing there, and it is more middle class family as well, women who are coming in. Again, we can talk about how there's the dream that this involvement in this will give them a bulk amount of money that will allow them to do things that they've aspired for, which they cannot do from their everyday work, like selling bangles or working in a garment factory or working in the field. But I do want to move to the paradox, and without which you cannot do the policy work. The fundamental difference between the way we talk about surrogacy in the global south and the way we can talk about surrogacy in the global north is that state policies in the global south, almost all the countries in the global south where surrogacy has moved to, have always been antenatal, right? So most women have had to historically struggle to get the most basic birth control methods, especially in India. And in some, what am I saying? While in the north, women had to struggle to get the most basic birth control methods, except black women, of course. In India, the state forced it on them. Again, very big similarities to many countries in the global south. And in the Indian state was the first in the world to have an official population control policy, and it was not as oppressive as the Chinese one, but of course many feminists have written about how there was only this performance of democracy in India. And the Indian population program, again, no news for most of you here, was not just the Indian government. It was very overtly shaped by the funding agents and USAID, UNFPA, and the World Bank. Again, true for countries like Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Tunisia, many other countries from where women are coming and to this workshop. So why is this important for our discussion and policies? Is because there's this sudden shift in the way these women are being thought about. Till now they were told don't have babies. Now they're being told have babies so that you can make money for the state, you can make money for yourself, and you can get yourself out of poverty. Quickly, I'm going to give you some ethnographic vignettes so that it's not just me talking. It's the surrogates who are talking about the state propaganda and this paradox of this labor market. So this is a 38-year-old woman, Varsha, who's had 3 children of her own, and now she's a surrogate for a couple from Canada. And she recalls the many visits, and this might not make sense to some of you, but in India there's a person called a dai, a nurse, a family planning nurse, who goes from village to village telling women not to have babies, right? And she tells them about long-term contraceptives, etc. So Varsha is saying that I never used contraceptive before, just regulated my intercourse, but the Didi, the family planning nurse, would stop at her huts on her visits and tell me to think about getting sterilization. But why do you not get it? She would say. She showed me pictures of women with one daughter where the daughter and mother would be smiling. She sometimes scolded me and said, that is why your condition is like this. The more babies you have, the poorer you get. Do you not understand that? Perhaps she's right. If I had not had my last child, the first 2 would be happier. But now the tables have turned. You see, it's my 4th pregnancy, this surrogate birth, that will make my family happy. So what's happening is that the commercial surrogacy drives women like Varsha to think of their bodies as a possible source of value for the first time, because this value has been historically denied by the state itself. And the money that they get through surrogacy is used in very interesting ways. They are determined to not use it for everyday purposes. It will go into a bank and it will be used for something big, like their daughter's education, for instance. Again, you'll see I'm not trying to romanticize this. I'm just trying to show you the paradox of this. Okay, and now Vidya, this one is a surrogate for a couple from Toronto. And she says that she kept on postponing sterilization. I have 2 daughters and 1 son. My husband wanted 1 more son, so we decided not to get sterilization done. So she doesn't get sterilized because her husband wanted to keep trying for a son. It must have been God's wish that I do this. By that she means become a surrogate. If I had got the operation done, I would have missed the chance to earn money for my children. But now that I'm successfully pregnant as a surrogate mother, I don't think I will try for another son anymore. I know my husband wants a son very badly, but I'm going to try and convince him. If I have a baby of my own, I will lose the chance to become a surrogate again. I want to conserve my body and save my next pregnancy for surrogacy. Dr. Madam does not want surrogates who have more than 3 babies of their own. So what Divya is doing is that she's postponed sterilization, resisted the instruction of family planning officials because husband wants son. But now in order to become a surrogate, she's willing to challenge her husband and forego having that son. Genetic baby pregnancy with their own baby versus pregnancy for surrogacy, it was kind of a trade-off, and they talked about it like a trade-off. So surrogate Parvati, this one is the most stark one, says that, and again you'll understand how for the first time the women are being exposed to any kind of reproductive health care, because when she came here the first time, the doctor said, when she came to the clinic the first time, the doctor said, I was too old to donate eggs, but I could try for surrogacy. I underwent treatment, injections, vagina check. During one of these early checkups, they realized that I was pregnant with my own child. We have just one child, we've always wanted one more, but at this stage we needed the money more than the baby, so I got my baby aborted. So it's literally a stark manifestation of what Shelley Collin has called stratified reproduction, where power relations by which some categories of people are empowered to nurture and reproduce while others are disempowered. But again, I find this label stratified motherhood a bit too benign, because this stratification did not happen by accident. It's a consequence of conscious national and global priorities that value the reproduction of only a certain race, class and nationality of women. And in my other book and in this book also, I've called it neo-eugenics, but we don't have time to go into racialization here. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about a slightly more uplifting conversation around this market. So these women know that they're involved in this really stigmatized, dirty market, right? And they're constantly trying to counter not just the contractual nature of their service, but also the transient or disposable role as mothers. Again, connects to what we were talking about in the morning with Ale. So right from recruitment to delivery, the surrogates' disposability is constantly reaffirmed by the doctors and the nurses. They are told that you are only a vessel, you have no genetic connection with the baby will be taken away from you immediately after delivery. Okay? In most cases, they are told that they will not be allowed to breastfeed the baby. And this, the doctors say that this rule exists so that the surrogates don't get emotionally attached to the baby, and that so that the intended parents don't face any legal battles later. Again, all this is data for the policy work that we're going to do later. But these discourses and these kind of narratives of disposability that is imposed on them do not go unresisted. So the surrogates constantly resist this by forging what I call kinship ties. In the book I call it kinship ties with the baby. So how do they do that? It's very interesting. So what again surrogate Parvati does, Parvati is a very interesting one because she's the oldest one in the clinic, and she wanted to become actually an egg donor, but she wasn't allowed to be. And I meet Parvati right after what is called a fetal reduction surgery, in which one of the fetuses had to be surgically eliminated. And this is very common in surrogacy. In India, in Ghana, in Cambodia, in Thailand, what they do is, because there are no laws or regulations, and the chances of a successful pregnancy is very low, what you do is that you put in as many embryos as possible. Like, I mean, seriously, crudely put, right? Instead of having rules around you're allowed to put only 2, because multiple births can be very dangerous for the baby and the surrogate, you want to maximize the outcome. So you put in as many embryos as possible. So fetal reduction surgery becomes a norm, and one of the things that the surrogates sign into is consent form which says, have I lost you or we are there? So fetal reduction surgery. So I meet Parvati after a fetal reduction surgery, and she says, what does she say? She says, Dr. Madam told us that the babies wouldn't get enough space to move around and grow, so I should get the surgery. But both Nandini Didi, the genetic mother, and I wanted to keep all 3 babies. I told Dr. Madam that I'll keep 1 and Didi can keep 2. After all, it's my blood, even if it's their genes. And who knows whether at my age, I'll be able to have more babies. So what Parvati is doing is that she's using her interpretation of the blood tie to make claims on the baby. Surrogate Ravina makes a very similar claim, but she adds sweat and blood to it. And she says that it's the labor of gestation, the sweat and blood of gestation, which makes her tie even bigger than the genetic tie. Again, something for our policy work later. And she says, she's very interesting. She's the only woman who had reached college, so education college. And she says, Anna, the genetic mother, wanted a girl. Oh, sorry. No. So I run into, where do I meet Ravina? She's just coming out of an ultrasound. Again, something very important for you to know, that in India, you're not allowed to reveal to the mother and the father what the sex of the child is. Because if it's a female fetus, they might choose to abort it, right? So now there's a law which says you can't really reveal the sex of the child to parents. But of course, all those laws don't hold for surrogacy. So Ravina says after her ultrasound, she's told that it's a boy. She's coming out after the second ultrasound, and she says, Anna, the genetic mother, wanted a girl, but I told her even before the ultrasound, coming from me, it will be a boy. My first 2 children were also boys, and this one will be 2. And see, I was right, it's a boy. After all, they just gave the eggs. But the blood, all the sweat, all the effort is mine. Of course, the baby is going after me. So here again, she is doing something which is very against the disposability narrative. She says that her sister Anna came in the 8th month and gave her a gift, and she gave her diamond earrings, and they have maintained a tie throughout and even after the baby is born and things like that. But Divya is one of the only ones who's had this kind of reciprocal relationship with the intended mother. Almost none of the surrogates had any relationship with the intended father, and you can understand why. But with the intended mothers, they all had a very nice relationship while the contract period was still on. But as soon as the baby was delivered, and baby was often taken away while the surrogate was still recovering from a C-section, this bond got severed. And again, lots of women talked to me about this. Diksha says, Jessie came to visit me during the, I'm sorry, I don't have that here. Jessie came to visit me during the God Bharai, which is the baby shower ritual. She gave me so many gifts. I thought she'd stay in touch with me. It's been 3 years today since she took away the baby. I wished Jessie in the morning on computer the first time, but now they have forgotten about me. And this forgotten about me is a narrative that keeps coming up. And Tejal is the one I think that I have there for you. There was a lot of problem with the delivery. I had to have 15 to 20 bottles of IV in just 2 days. By that, of course, she means through intravenously she had to get. I got a scissor. By that, she means cesarean section. I was unconscious when the couple came and took the baby away. They didn't even show it to my husband. The baby would have been 3 years, but I don't even know what he looks like. I used to think they'll invite me to America. I used to think of her as a sister. Forget an invitation. They don't even come to see whether I'm dead or alive. They just finished their business, picked up the baby, and left. So again, another narrative, very similar. But in this one, Munni, who's talking about this, seems extremely disturbed. She doesn't know what she did wrong, why they have abandoned her. In some sense, this sounds very familiar to all of us who have worked or anything to do with labor, where once the contract is completed, for these women, the reproduction becomes a classic example of alienated labor. Her clients honored the contract, they paid her, appropriated the surplus value of her labor, the baby. Okay, so what I would ideally want to do is move to my the next sort of embodied labor, which is a complete contrast in some sense to these Indian surrogates lying pregnant, where we can actually imagine them as these workers who are oppressed, who are sitting in a baby farm, black women in India. Now we're going to talk about white women, all college educated, sitting somewhere in Stellenbosch, somewhere in Cape Town, and we're going to talk about another form of labor which might seem very different from this, but is actually very much connected. I do want to just give a little 2-minute history of how, not just how South Africa fits into this fertility industry. Of course, we're sitting in South Africa, it's important to connect it, bring it back home, and important to understand how South Africa fits into the fertility industry. But it's also interesting, although not surprising perhaps, that these two post-colonial countries, South Africa and India, because of the history of colonialism as well as the economics of neoliberal markets, have allowed for many parallel moments in biomedicine, reproductive biomedicine, and now reproductive tourism or reproductive travel. And what is very relevant for our understanding of these two connected labor markets that define the fertility industry, so gamete provision and surrogacy, is that in both India and South Africa, although demand side factors, for instance, increased incidence of infertility and societal stigma of being childless. So if you pick up any kind of scientific journal on it's always about sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa together, and they talk about infertility, they talk about the stigma of infertility, they talk about the demand for these treatments. That's not a lie, but the fact is that the supply side of it dominates the demand side. And the booming market in ARTs, assisted reproductive technologies, in both India and South Africa is primarily driven by supply side factors. So people, scientists and medical professionals did not wait to see whether there's a demand for infertility treatment in these countries. They brought it to these countries. They created the demand. Supply came before demand, and that's really important to understand. And this supply side bias can be sustained in economies like India and South Africa because of the historically stratified infrastructure, the stratified health infrastructure, neoliberalization of healthcare, rise of what are called private sector corporate hospitals or 5-star luxury hospitals, all of which have allowed these countries to become hubs for medical travel or reproductive travel. And that's very important for us to understand and bring to the front right away, is that the public healthcare system in both these countries are floundering, and we know that. But at the same time, there is an increasing investment in cutting edge technology, 5-star luxury hospitals, and these hospitals very often cater to either the elite, the diaspora, for instance in Ghana, or to international clients, right? So they're just meant for reproductive travel. And while India, and you've just seen how India became this controversial hub for reproductive tourism based on paid gestation, South Africa for 2 decades now is a preferred destination for what is called in, I guess in mainstream media, egg safaris, where gamete recipients, so people who want to receive eggs, intended recipients of eggs, they are traveling from Europe, Australia, North America, and they are matched with white South African egg providers. And while they travel to South Africa to get matched with the egg provider, they also told, why don't you go to Kruger and enjoy a safari? That's why the name egg safari. So they're traveling to South Africa to get matched with the egg provider and at the same time have some fun, go see some lions on the side. Okay, and of course we cannot not talk about racialization here. It is stark that these people are coming to South Africa to get matched with white egg providers. So the global fertility industry, not the national fertility industries of various countries, the global fertility industry is stark in its whiteness. And that's the part I write. It's only about that article. I will not be talking about that because we're talking about worlds of work here, and there's way too much to talk about in the fertility industry. But it cannot not miss our attention, the irony that the egg safari is happening for white eggs. Very crude, but that's the way fertility industry talks about eggs and sperms. White eggs, brown eggs, white sperm, black sperm. So it depends, and of course this is also racialization of gametes. We'll talk a little bit about these why this whiteness coming from South Africa. But I am not so much interested in talking to you about egg safaris. What I want you to get more familiar with is what is called traveling egg provision. So egg safari itself is very interesting, but traveling egg provision is what is far more connected to our global fertility industry, because now and this is quite new, this has happened only in the last decade, where there's a growing trend of young white South African women flying to the various fertility hubs across the world. So the fertility hubs could be India, it could be Cambodia, it could be Cyprus, it could be Thailand, it could be the United States, it could be Namibia. These are all global fertility hubs. Again, understand that the clients in these hubs are not locals of Ghana. These are all people who want to save some money. So Israeli gay client who wants to bypass some of the rules of the rabbi in Israel, perhaps. They want to be able to find an egg provider who they can check out, not just her childhood pictures, but actually check her out. They want to have an informal relationship with the egg provider. Many reasons why people move away from the national fertility world to the global fertility world. And these white South African egg providers are mainly being called in to these global fertility hubs because they are white, of course, but also because, and I talk a lot about whether it's authentic whiteness, how the whiteness is being framed by the clients, or these are not the Spanish kind of white. These are different kind of whites. Then some others talk about how there's a connection between Afrikaner white women and some Dutch and German intended parents, for instance, find this kind of whiteness connection because of the Dutch heritage. Many things that you can read about. But the way whiteness is constructed is also very interesting. But I want to look at it from the point of view of the laborers themselves, the egg providers, and what makes them get into the market. Because as we saw, these Indian surrogates are getting there out of desperate poverty. What is making these white women get into this job of egg provision? Because a lot of them are doing it 9 times, 10 times, 11 times, even though the guidelines in South Africa say that you cannot do it more than 5 times. Most of them are doing it 11 to 12 times. Almost all of them are very well-educated women. Some of them get to hear about this egg provision from flyers in bathrooms at UCT in Stellenbosch. So yeah, a lot of my students have provided their eggs. Okay, so why does the language, the framing of this work then need to be thought of differently? Okay, so April 2016, this is Julie, a South African woman. She took to Facebook to post her story with the hashtag I was not egg-sploited. So Julie is talking about traveling to Thailand and India to donate her eggs. And she says, I urge all young girls interested in becoming egg donors to do their research, not only on what the procedure entails, but also do extensive research on the agencies that they choose to go through. Julie was writing in response to a news broadcast on this news, I think it was the Carte Blanche that aired it. It was a segment called exploited, and they describe the medical risks in the growing trend of traveling egg provision from South Africa. That is, young women who are flying to these countries in the global south, in the third world, to provide their eggs. Because of course for these fertility professionals, South Africa is first world. So why exploited? Of course, that's a clever pun on exploited. But there are chances of real physical harm in egg provision. And I'm not sure how many of you are actually aware of the kind of medical procedures involved. It is nothing like sperm provision. So of course we know that sperm providers can just go to a clinic and masturbate and come out. That's not how egg provision works. I'm sure you know that. So egg provision involves many, many different layers of surveillance, invasive medical procedures. First is the daily injection of hormones, which in many cases the egg providers do it themselves. So they put the injections themselves. Or if they feel a little queasy about that, they can go to a den leader who will put it for them. I'll tell you what a den leader is. So this is the injection of hormones to increase the production of eggs. This is followed by a short surgical procedure, which is always done under not local but general anesthesia, to extract the eggs. And there are many risks involved in these procedures. And again, we can go into this whole, quite a bit of writing by reproductive justice scholars and especially activists who work on reproductive health, how these kind of studies do not get published, which talk about the long-term harm of long-term contraceptives as well as things like these hormonal injections. And long-term contraceptives and these hormonal injections are actually very similar in the hormone content. And these long-term side effects are not even talked about by any scientists. Forget telling it to the egg providers. But the exploitation bit that this media is talking about is not just these physical risks. They are arguing that egg provision, very similar to surrogacy, is simply morally reprehensible. It's akin to a trade in women's bodies. And again, these get compounded when there is cross-border provision. When it becomes global, the anxieties become multifold, because people feel that the fear that money might induce some young women to take decisions that they would not have taken otherwise, and also the fear that these clinics might be dirty, they might not have the same standards. All the women identified as middle class, which is again too broad to be useful for us, for our purposes here. But when you start digging in more, what do your parents do, for instance? It's important for us to know what their parents do, because these are all very young women. Some of them haven't left their parents' house. So then they go on to tell you that they were brought up not wealthy, they were brought up in small farms, their mothers worked as secretaries, caregivers, nurses. And then you start understanding the nuances of this middle class. They belong to a particular class of whiteness, and that must be kept in mind. But their own lifestyles and aspirations are not, they do not want to be like their parents. That's for sure. They've already, from their first round of donation, they want to start getting a car. They want to work in jobs which give them flexible hours. Most of them work in the beauty or wellness industry. So they have one aspiration, which is to be not like their parents. And how do these women discuss their involvement in the industry? Again, quite important to understand the difference between the kind of work is the reason why these workers want to do this work. This is what I've called cosmopolitan competency in the article in Gender and Society. But that doesn't matter what I call it. The point is that there's this aspiration to be cosmopolitan. And again, that connects to which class, economic class, these women are coming from. They might call themselves middle class, but most of them did not have a passport before they became traveling egg providers. So one of the biggest pull was the fertility clinic, the global fertility clinic was going to help them get a passport. So their travel for egg provision is literally the first stamp, the first visa on their passport. Almost none of them talked about altruism, which for anybody who has ever read anything on egg donation would be startled by, because the entire literature on egg donation starts with altruism. Women are often told that to become an egg donor, you have to declare that you are doing it for only altruistic reason. Another very gendered kind of lens of looking at this work. But in this traveling egg provision world, these egg providers are very candid. They say that, for instance, Brianna, she says that she was initially matched with a South African recipient, but she turned down the offer because she saw no reason to do it domestically. And a lot of them will talk about exactly this, that the only reason I'm doing it is so that I can travel. Why would I want to donate for a South African couple sitting in South Africa? It makes no sense. So it's not just the money. The money is extra pocket money for them, but they're doing it to come back and tell their friends. In the University of Stellenbosch that I went, and I had dinner overlooking the White House. Again, I'm not sure all this is very interesting but to you at the moment or for our discussion later, but there is some kind of if you're interested in the critical whiteness studies literature emerging from the South, especially from South Africa, there's quite a bit written about how Afrikaner women, Afrikaner whites are talked about differently than English-speaking whites, and how they are considered, Afrikaner whites are considered lesser whites. They often don't own passports, while English-speaking whites or British whites would often have dual passports. So this whole, all these women, sorry, I don't know whether I said that, all these women are Afrikaner women, white Afrikaner women. And one of the other things, again, so all of this is Shazan. She talks about how she comes from a very conservative family. Shazan has done this 11 times now, right? And she's done it for global fertility clinics in literally any exotic place you can dream about, whether that be Cyprus or Cambodia, United States, Thailand, everywhere she's gone and provided eggs, Brazil as well. But she says, I would not dream of revealing what I'm doing to my father. He'll throw us to the lions. She and her sister both do it. This to him would be like prostitution. So there's a reason why these women are doing it. They are doing it for cosmopolitanism. They're doing it to escape their conservative farm background. They're doing it to be different. The desire of these women is very important to understand why they are not doing it for the money. Very often these women go with the $2,000 to a place and they actually end up spending the entire $2,000 in that country. So for instance, there's a very interesting group that I traveled with to Nepal with, and almost all of them, there were 13 of us who traveled together to Nepal. All of us, I didn't get paid obviously because nobody wants my eggs at this age, but all the women ended up spending the entire $2,000 because they wanted to do a helicopter ride. So it's not the money that is pulling them into this, and that's very important to understand. They want to escape their routine life. They want to be able to imitate upper class, cosmopolitan behavior. Most of them keep their egg donation a secret from their fathers, and some of them have told their mums. This one, she's saying, she is another very interesting woman. She's done it, this was I think her third time, and she says that all this bullshit about altruism, she finds it hilarious that the entire egg donation literature, she studies at a university in the social sciences, and she finds it hilarious that all the literature is about altruism and maternity. She says, you know, there's nothing emotional about this for me. I never wanted kids and I never will. And you can read the narrative there. She's constantly trying to say that this is the closest she'll ever get to feeling maternal. She says, I did this for the money the first time. The intended parents was insisting on a Skype call, so I gave in. They were a gorgeous Israeli couple. And really gorgeous, and it changed my perspective about this. I could create life for these people. I know I would not want one of mine to hold, but they sure did. You know, some people get so sore with the injection and meds, but for me, even that felt kind of magical. Whenever I get hormonal or bloated, I used to tell myself, this will be the closest I will ever get to feeling pregnant. Another kind of constant narrative that I came across, that I don't ever want to be a mother. So this is the closest I'll get to mummyhood, is a word that they often used, that constantly re-emphasized their lack of maternal desires, and that they were not emotional about this, and that this was a direct challenge to their families, and in some sense a direct challenge to the conservative Afrikaner understanding of motherhood. Symbols of femininity, of white femininity. Again, people like Pande Westhuizen have written about it, if you're interested, about how conservative, middle-class white Afrikaner families construct white femininity around compulsory motherhood. So in some sense, this is their escape from that kind of narrative. Better your chances of being allowed to become an egg provider. So by vociferously announcing to others and convincing themselves that their maternity is secondary, the women are literally in some sense setting their labor free to roam the world and become traveling egg providers. I want to move to this point about productive pain because it's really important to understand the painful nature of this work that they do. I don't think we read enough about the invasiveness of egg provision. There just isn't enough literature. And I don't know if any of you have provided eggs in this room, but the process is medically very painful and invasive. It's very labor intensive. And I already explained to you how it's about mature follicles, getting as many mature follicles as possible. It's not just getting the eggs that come in naturally. It's about making sure that the woman produces extra eggs. So she needs to have a bloated ovary to be able to do this. And one of the most common side effect is what is called OHSS, which is ovarian hyperstimulation. That happens to a lot of women, and that depends a lot. I don't want to go into too many details, but that also depends on the protocol that the doctor follows in different countries in the trigger shot. So depending on how sophisticated a trigger you're using, your chances of ovarian hyperstimulation gets lowered. Again, as I said, very little about the long-term health consequences of this. And again, that is what is keeping this fertility industry going. Do not talk about the long-term health effects on people, and that's what it will, that's how you keep pushing all this under the carpet. But what is very interesting is that all the women love to talk about the scans, the triggers, the retrieval, and they all talk about it being very painful and very frightening. So the egg providers themselves are very cognizant of the embodied labor, the labor-intensive nature of their work. But when it comes to donor days, where they all sit together and there's a lot of laughter and champagne and chocolates and photo shoots, all this is not talked about at all. So in the group testimonials, there's someone called, a donor day is started by what is called a den leader. So a woman who has done it several times and who will now be the leader of the traveling egg provision group. So if a couple of women, say 5 of them, are traveling to Cambodia to provide the eggs on the next trip, then there's always a den leader who's selected. So the doctor does not go with them everywhere. They'll have a connection with the local doctor there in Cambodia, but there'll be a den leader who will be managing their emotions, not so much the biomedical part of it. They'll be managing the emotions, and that is where the clinics play a very important role in managing the language, in discipline the women into thinking of this as productive pain. So there are these narratives that you can look at where they talk about how the girls learn so much about this, about their own body, how this is a magical experience, it's a transformational experience. These are all quotes that I'm taking from various narratives. Even the trigger shot, which is the most painful thing ever, is made into a fun thing. They're given a pink cushion with the trigger shot, and their pictures are taken. Everything is made into a fun thing, a magical journey, to minimize the pain and effort of the process. They're given timestamps and photographs. Trigger shot is made fun, donor pillows, and the talk that the egg agency owner gives is also another very interesting one, where they are told not so much about the health effects, but what they are told, that they must be disciplined. They must do what the agency wants them to do, otherwise they might get into trouble and cause themselves harm. So the message is clear. An egg provider will be harmed, a worker in a factory will be harmed only if she does not follow the management rules. Otherwise, there is no other harm that is being talked about. So this is what I call bioresponsibilization. And I want to now very explicitly connect the two so that we can move on to policy work by talking about the trafficking metaphor. And the trafficking metaphor comes up very often when we talk about whether it be the biolabor of surrogates or egg providers. And Nancy Shapiro-Hughes is a medical anthropologist who has written a lot about this kind of work as transplant tourism. So she's compared the transplant safari that used to happen, the transplant tourism that used to happen, to this kind of reproductive tourism. And there's one article of hers which I can make available if anyone is interested, where she talks about Israeli patients on transplant tourism in South Africa, where they go on a safari and also get a live kidney transplant. In that paper, she has a section titled "Have Kidneys, Will Travel." And there she talks about a Brazilian kidney seller traveling from a Brazilian shanty town to sell his kidneys in South Africa. And then this Brazilian returns home with photos of Zulu dancers and giraffes and ostriches and memories of his first global travel. And what Nancy Shapiro-Hughes does is that she frames transplant tourism as a dark underbelly of neoliberal globalization and the demands that it creates and how it forces the Brazilian to want upward mobility. But entirely in this analysis of traffic, what ends up happening is that the desire of the Brazilian kidney seller is not talked about at all, because that seems a conversation that will take us away from exploitation and trafficking. So again, my problem with this trafficking metaphor is exactly this, that it does not allow us to get to these nuances, because the entire fertility industry is built on desires. Desires of women, desires that are created very often, desires of gay men, desires of professionals, desires of these egg providers, and we need to talk about these desires and motivations of these workers without romanticizing choice, keeping in mind racialization, keeping in mind untouchability and what it does to the language of choice, but to understand that the entire industry can be sustained despite so many bans, despite so many problems, because people either desire a better life, or people desire a certain kind of eggs, or people desire genetically related baby, people desire a certain kind of race in a baby or racialize a baby in a certain way, and that is how this industry can continue.